So thank you very much for inviting me here and for being so generous. This is really an incredibly agreeable and luxurious conference. I'm going to betray you a little bit because I'm not going to speak exactly on my abstract. I was so excited by the subject that I made my inaugural talk last week on it. So it's printed, it's out here. I'm giving it to you if you want to see what I was about to do. And I'm giving to you one element of this connected to the question of nihilism, because the whole would have been too long. I don't want to, keep you here for several hours with me only. I'm going to do one. So you can have a look at it afterwards if you want to know what I'm promising.
And we can keep this?
Yeah,
Oh,
it's for you. My university decided to print lots of them, so I want to give it to you. But that's if you want to know afterwards. But what I'm doing now is on the question of nihilism, more directly. So today is actually not only the second day of our conference, but it's also the first day of the 28th COP conference in Dubai. You might have noticed this morning in the news that the average temperature of the world has risen for 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial level. The temperature of Europe has risen 2.3 degrees already. And last Friday, the 17th November, the average temperature of the planet rose for the first time momentarily about 2 degrees. Whereas you remember perhaps that in Paris COP conference in 2015, most states of the world pledged to prevent the global temperature rise beyond 1.5 degree. So my question is, isn't our task as philosophers today also to think through global warming? Should we not engage with a contradiction between the active nihilism of humankind as a whole that has led to this objective nihilism of global warming and the passive nihilism of inaction in front of global warming? I think so. And this is why in this paper I will ask what is called nihilism in the epoch of global warming. Is global warming the extreme of nihilism? Or is it on the contrary a reality which obliges us to overcome any form of our native modern nihilism? So first of all, what I take nihilism to be. In a small text published in Collège International de Philosophie seminar, Proceedings Traversées du Nihilisme, Crossings of Nihilism, Jean-Luc Nancy explains Nietzsche's distinction between active and passive nihilism by making a distinction between destruction and extinction. The sense of nihilism, he thinks, oscillates in the ambiguity between active forces of destruction and passive exhaustion of forces until their extinction. Nihilism itself, he says, the extreme of nihilism, lies in this in-between, in which we need to decide not exactly between active and passive nihilism, but on the interpretation of their in-between. This decision can fall on endless destruction, and I'm quoting Nancy, nuclear terror, destruction by wars, famines, illnesses, increasing population growth, alternance of devastation and its palliatives, loss of sense and supplements of soul, and so on and so forth. It is not by chance, he continues, that extermination, in the sense of ending without end, without termination, annihilation without nihil, is the key word of the age of nihilism. Interminable extermination, ordinary state of affairs, end of quote. However, when it is a question of nihilism, the core of this interminable extermination is not the extermination of life in all its forms. the core problem of extermination of sense, the core problem is the extermination of sense, which then may motivate extermination of life. And this is why Nietzsche hints at two ways of deciding against extermination. One of them consists in creating new sense, new values, perhaps a new religion after the old one. Answering to the problem of loss of sense by creating a new idol is the easy answer. The other one of them consists in experimenting the extreme of nihilism, making a step into nothingness. That does not mean anything like accelerating extermination. That would be totally wrong. On the contrary, that means understanding that sense is not something that we have. It is, or have or don't have. It is something that we are. As Nancy says elsewhere, I quote, "We don't have the sense, we are the sense." Sense is not the sense of existence, it is existence itself. He says, I'm quoting once more, "Every existing singularity, that is to say, every individual or collective, instantaneous or prolonged configuration of existence is such an introduction of sense," end of quote. And this is where Nancy joins Gianni Vattimo's idea that nihilism is actually the reverse side of freedom of existence. Accomplished nihilism, says Vattimo, I quote, like Heidegger's Abgrund, presents itself at the same time as our only possibility of freedom, end of quote. So I believe that Nancy and Vattimo are right in their reformulation of the question of the sense of human life. The experience of nihilism somehow purifies experience, so that it becomes possible to discover the liberty of existence itself in this very world. But I also think that for us today, this is only the first step in the long path of crossing of nihilism. For us, the problem is much bigger. It's not the exhaustion of sense, but the concrete tendency of exhaustion of both human and non-human life. More precisely, the sense of human life is not for us a lesser problem, while the greater problem resides in the relation of human life to the totality of non-human life, of which it depends. Human life is deeply affected, I'd say it's wounded, by the deterioration of the planetary life world. And that is why the question of nihilism for us is perhaps no more a simple question of destructive and exhausted human forces. It is also the question of the erosion of non-human life, of the entire planetary biosphere that is wounded by the destruction and exhaustion of conditions of all life. This destruction was not intended by the humankind, but what was caused by it anyway. The question is then, how can we think through this other nihilism that has no name yet, but that looms in the horizon as a kind of and I was really looking to understand what it is, objective nihilism, realistic, natural, material nihilism of the planetary life world as a whole. So, to get into this question, I start by speaking about disaster. Is this deterioration of the conditions of all life a nihilistic event? In what follows, I will start by reinterpreting the ill-fitting term real nihilism. It doesn't even exist, I suppose. In terms of disaster, a world undergoing global warming. And then we'll see how it fits into the question of nihilism. I do not need to explain to you what global warming is. I take the scientific work of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, as an evidence starting point, and I take it for granted that, like all enlightened citizens, you are already aware of the main results. My question is instead the existential signification of this work. My hypothesis is that it cannot be explained in habitual terms of catastrophe, but it needs to be rethought as an unprecedented disaster, of which we have an equally unprecedented impersonal experience. And both of these two terms, disaster and impersonal experience, need philosophical clarification. There's nothing evident about them. And this is what I try to do here. And in the end, I will then ask how these contribute to this crossing of nihilism that we are constantly in the process of doing. So why the term disaster? From a scientific point of view, global warming is a measurable evolution of the planetary climatic system. That's not a disaster, it's an evolution. But it's from the everyday existential point of view that this represents an immeasurable disaster that destabilizes our social and natural life worlds. It is, of course, not literally an end of the world. It is a deleterious erosion of the world that appears disastrous, because in addition to wounding the planetary life world, it also wounds and even paralyzes our thinking. We only ever want to live like before, but we know that precisely by living like before, we make it impossible to live like before. And this kind of a conflict is paralyzing. And that's why, on a collective level, humankind appears so, well, let's say, impotent between the disaster. In public debates, global warming is often characterized in terms of catastrophe. Of course, nobody likes catastrophes. And that's why the climate scientist discourse, which warns about dangerous developments, is frequently contradicted by the so-called climate denialists or climate reassurists, or even by what the climatologists called Christophe Cassou calls climate I don't give a damists. In addition to this, there are also philosophers who refuse catastrophic thought in general because it's depressing. Like, for instance, Michel Fussell, who rejects catastrophism as hysterical apocalypticism, which does not notice that the thought of catastrophe is the end of thought. Or on the other hand, in a distant echo to Hans Jonas's heuristics of fear, Jean-Pierre Dupuy fashions an enlightened catastrophism, which promotes a reasonable use of unreasonable fears. Both of these approaches rely on enlightened reason, but they don't pay, I think, sufficient attention to its limits. Because the first one reduces real dangers to psychological weaknesses, and the second one does not really tell how to handle the contradiction between the injunction of trying to reason terror. You don't reason terror. So what I would like to do instead is taking fears and anxieties tied to global warming seriously. I think that fear has its reasons that reason does not see, and that we really need to clarify the reasons of fear. And I do think that the word disaster, in the precise sense formulated first by Maurice Blanchot in L'écriture du désastre, is precious here, because it allows me precisely to avoid the usual term of catastrophe. So what does Blanchot mean by disaster? One should understand this term in contradistinction to Heidegger's thinking of the Ereignis. To put it very, very shortly, Ereignis is for Heidegger the event that gives the possibility to think. And even nihilism in this sense is this kind of an event. It gives to think. In Was heißt denken, Heidegger says that the human being can think insofar as the possibility of thinking is already given to it. This possibility is das Bedenklichste, the most thought-provoking, as it's translated. And this awkward expression, the most thought-provoking, is shorthand for Heidegger's fundamental claim that before we can even start thinking, there is something to be thought. We think because something calls us to think. The most thought-provoking, the thing that gives itself to be thought, is fundamentally the sense of being, or as Heidegger puts it in 52 when he writes Was heißt denken, Ereignis, this event that we render here as a gift of time or gift of being. So I'm not going here to any further into the arcanes of the correct interpretation of Ereignis, but I would like to attract attention on the mode in which it gives itself to think. Firstly, it precisely gives itself, and this gift possibilizes all thinking. It's in the mode of possibility. And secondly, it's a gift without presence, and this without presence is quite interesting for us as well. Because it gives itself to be thought, but it gives itself as a question that withdraws the possibility of fixing an answer. And this is where Heidegger gets us. But I think that here Heidegger leaves us on the verge of something that he does not bring to the end. And I think that the writer who has drawn the most radical consequences of the event of thinking is Maurice Blanchot. In his book, Writing of the Disaster, L'écriture du désastre, Blanchot radicalizes the idea of thinking as a potency that can also remain impotent, and of the most thought-provoking as a possibility that can also remain non-realized. Because he conceives a very tight idea of a potency that does not turn into possibility, and of the most thought-provoking that turns into an unthinkable. It's not just that we don't think, but we can't think. There is nothing to think, or thought loses its powers. His example here is not nihilism, it is the Holocaust. Blanchot describes an awareness that is not a capacity that somebody, or poet or a thinker, could hold on to, because in Blanchot's case, there is not anybody left who could be capable. Capacity lacks the person capable. The very last remnant of an I disappears in an anonymity in which there is no more I who thinks. Thinking still happens to somebody, but this somebody cannot be identified. It cannot even identify itself. Powerless, impotent, less than passive, it is nothing more than the kind of a wakefulness that accompanies insomnia, when one is incapable of sleeping and totally exposed to something that Blanchot calls the lucid second night behind the first night of reparative dreams. And I'm quoting Blanchot here. Something wakes. Something keeps watch without lying in wait or spying. The disaster watches. When there is such watching, when sleeping consciousness, opening into unconsciousness, lets the light of the dream play, then what watches, the wake, or the impossibility of sleep at the heart of sleep? That what watches does not illuminate with an increase of visibility, of reflecting brilliance. Who watches? The question is obviated by the neutrality of the watch. No one watches. End of quote. A bit complicated, Blanchot always. Even when no one is there is watchfulness. It's this passive tense. Watchfulness to what comes. And what comes? Not the possibility of questioning that Heidegger took to be the beginning of thinking, not the possibilizing event of Ereignis, which Heidegger sometimes likens to the passing of a god, and which is, with or without God, an event of sense. L'écriture du désastre is the very contrary of such a promise of sense. After all, it is the book about the Holocaust insofar as it is unthinkable. As also Adorno and Lyotard think, it defies the very possibility of thinking. Only the disaster is there, and it does not bring the possibility of a new sense of the world. On the contrary. Another quotation from Blanchot. It is not thought that the disaster causes to disappear, but rather questions and problems, affirmation and negation, silence and speech, sign and insignia from thought. Then in the night without darkness, that has no sky, in the night heavy with the absence of the world and withdrawn from all self-presence, thought watches, end of quote. And yet Blanchot says the disaster is a gift, in the sense that the disaster is still something that, by just watching, calls to think, even though the inherited means of thought fail to address it meaningfully. To think about the disaster, both enlightened reason, dialectical reason, and even phenomenological thinking find themselves powerless. So, how to be up to the disaster? In L'écriture du désastre, Blanchot explores extreme ways of being wakeful to what is given, not as the most thought-provoking, but on the contrary as an unthinkable. It is an impossibility of thinking that still imposes itself to thought. Blanchot thinks that the disaster cannot be described by the positive acts of thinking because it is the disaster of known ways of thinking. Blanchot does not think it possible to bypass the disaster of thinking, but he describes the element of powerlessness to which thinking is now exposed. This element he calls the night, not this first night of dreams, but the second night of impersonal insomnia. And in this insomnia, the night is awake, the sleepless is exposed to night without having the strength to close eyes or to it or to clarify it. And here, thinking of potency finds its summum of extreme impotency. So, that is Blanchot's most dark book in many ways. But what does it have to do with the disaster of global warming? Obviously, Blanchot did not develop the notion of disaster in order to speak about global warming. Like many of his contemporaries, he was unaware of it, I suppose, and probably inclined to reject ecological questions. That was not their world. So the term cannot be transposed directly on our time. Blanchot thought disaster with reference to finite human communities, albeit one that has lost its consistency, whereas global warming is a planetary techno-natural event that concerns totally everybody. But keeping these limitations in mind, I think Blanchot's term disaster is useful in the task of thinking about global warming, because it helps us articulate three important features of thinking of global warming today. Firstly, Blanchot's term disaster actually means evil star. It differs from human tragedies and catastrophes because it is not a thought-provoking event that clarifies the sense of human life. It does not add to our understanding of our life, but it's a frightening event that strikes us as unthinkable. I quote once more. The disaster, says Blanchot, depriving us that refuge which is the thought of death, dissuading us from the catastrophic or the tragic, dissolving our interest in will and all internal movement, is the unknown name for that in thought itself that dissuades from thinking of it. The thought of the disaster overflows every variety of thought as the intense, silent, and disastrous affirmation of the outside. End of quote. So this disaster is not inclined towards us humans. It's not a gift of sense. It's just an overpowering, impersonal event. And also global warming is obviously an overpowering, impersonal event. It is a planetary natural process that results from the activity of human industrial civilization without anybody intending it as such. It is not a human tragedy, it is a planetary disaster, insofar as it is not destined to any specific human individual or community, but befalls indifferently upon everybody, upon every living being, more than humans. Secondly, Blanchot says that the disaster is not a fact nor an event. It has no presence. He says, I quote, not only because there is no I to undergo the experience, but because since the disaster always takes place after having taken place, there cannot possibly be any experience of it, end of quote. Similarly, global warming cannot be experienced here and now. It is a kind of an event, but it's not the event typically understood, that is to say, a remarkable happening that breaks history in two, like the death of God or the advent of a new God. On the contrary, global warming is remarkably unremarkable. It does not appear as singular because it takes place everywhere on the planet, and it does not appear as event-like because its duration counts in centuries and actually millennia, if you think towards the future. Of course, it's not really the natural process itself. It is our realization that constitutes an event for us. But our realization is not exactly an advent of a new truth either. It is just a gradual obsolescence of our inherited concept of world, when we realize that maintaining the world we know by living like before actually amounts to destroying the very world we try to maintain. In this sense, the event of global warming provokes the unworlding of all finite homeworlds. It pushes them out of joint and shows their fault lines by showing how they rely on unforeseen events of planetary techno-nature. It's not easy to stop seeking the sense of one's life in the familiar homeworld and start seeking it in the entire planetary techno-nature instead. We want to say, no, that's not our world. Because this requires changing all coordinates of traditional thinking of the world, including the classical phenomenological concept of world. I cannot do the detail of this complicated change of the phenomenological concept of world here, but I can say very quickly that thinking through the event of global warming breaks through the traditional phenomenological coordinates of the world, namely the locality and the historicity, which are the classical coordinates of finitude. Although global warming is revealed by universalist science, it does reveal the planet itself as a finite historical place. But this planetary finitude overflows the traditional notion of finitude. Think of Heidegger. It's not the same. It also calls for a new understanding of finitude. The dimensions of planetary finitude are no more locality and historicity, but something that I have elsewhere called the displace, planetary displace, and something that Ted Toadvine has called the deep history of nature. Planetary techno-nature is not local because it takes place everywhere in the dimension of technological, economical, ecological globalization. It is a displace in the sense that it's a non-place where no one can bauen, wohnen, denken, and in the sense also that its place appearing only in terms of displacements and transitions of human beings and goods and energy and information and all of that. Such a place is the uninhabitable dimension of general unhomeliness and alienation. We have been speaking about it here. Similarly, planetary techno-nature cannot be inserted in historicity because it evolves along the non-human deep history of nature. Human historicity tends to become a story that moves from our past towards our future. And human historicity also understands global warming in this sense, either in nihilistic terms as collapse and catastrophe of human societies, or in terms of more optimistic terms of progress and technological solutions of anti-catastrophism. But actually, the deep time of nature does not care about this narration. It does not predict a future of doom and salvation, because its disasters only operate neutral change. The planetary ecosystem changes. So for brevity, I cannot develop these terms anymore here. They presuppose their transcendental conditions, maybe ontological changes, but we don't do it here. I just wanted to say that when you think the concept of world in this planetary extension, all of the other phenomenological coordinates have to be changed as well. And thirdly, global warming does not happen to anybody in particular, but to everybody as an anonymous mass. Like Blanchotian disaster, global warming is a curious calamity that destroys the I who would undergo this experience. It plunges us into this impersonality and anonymity that Heidegger calls das Man. Actually, the question of the way in which this impersonal disaster of global warming affects human thinking is quite multi-layered, because what happens in scientific thinking and what happens in our existential thinking do not amount to the same. Scientific thinking is powerful as ever. It has shown its power in the discovery of the very phenomenon of global warming, of which we wouldn't know anything without science. However, one cannot experience this scientific fact personally. And that's at least what the climate historian Dipesh Chakrabarty says. He says that this is why people tend to be indifferent towards global warming. But I think that in this particular case, the impersonal scientific studies become existentially significant. Actually, they do affect us existentially. But they do this in a specific kind of impersonal affective mood. Stimmung des Mann, if you can think of such a thing. So this impersonal effect sounds somewhat paradoxical, but it is, I think, central to the understanding of the particular existential situation that global warming engenders. So it seems to me that this impersonal effect arisen by global warming first affects people in two ways, which are actually the two sides of the same effect. One has been described by Catherine Malabou, who is following Chakrabarty and who has said that the Anthropocene, of which global warming is the most imposing aspect, I think, is mostly met with indifference. Indifference would then be the most common effect towards global warming, and that makes changes difficult, of course. But it seems to me that this is only one side of the coin, because global warming can also cause despair. And indifference is one way of dealing with despair. Now I don't understand despair as a pathology that should be cured. Instead, I understand despair as a specific, in the specific existential sense given to this affect by Claude Romano in his book L'Événement et le Monde. He does not speak about global warming either, but only of personal experiences. But yes, you apply things. For Romano, despair is a painful apathy in which I cannot appropriate things that happen to me, but I sink in an impersonal, groundless anonymity in which I quote, I am there without being there, in an impersonal stupefaction in which suffering becomes painless, end of quote. This impersonal pain is painless because there is no I to whom suffering would happen. This painful, painless despair is caused by a specific modality of the world in which, I quote, the world does not world anymore. Le monde ne modernise pas. Die Welt weltet nicht. It is impossible to be interested in the world or integrate events into a world. Romano continues, I quote, despair manifests a dimension of human adventure that Heidegger did not pay attention to. A pre-personal dimension that existential analytic left aside because it started from existence which is for itself, Willen seiner, and postulated a selfhood, Gemeinigkeit. On the contrary, despair testifies of a fundamental anonymity of human adventure, end of quote. And this anonymity, I think, is very close to the impersonal insomnia that Blanchot described in L'écriture du désastre. However, while in Blanchot's thinking, the disaster leaves the human being stunned and paralyzed, perhaps still very nihilistic. On the contrary, in Romano's thinking, there is a way out. Romano affects analyses such as sadness and despair and fear, not at all as pathologies, but as fundamental ways of relating to the events that deconstitute and constitute the world. A world is for him a certain articulation of things. When an event occurs, a world articulation is disjointed and disarticulated. The event is something that does not fit in. Like here, the news of global warming is something that does not fit in our ways of doing. What Romano calls the human adventure then consists in reconstituting and rearticulating the world after an event has disarticulated it. The task of thinking is this new articulation of the world, disarticulated by the disaster. This does not mean healing and mending the world so that it becomes the same as before. On the contrary, the disaster is deeply destabilizing, because we know that the world will never be the same again. It is a disaster of thinking that finds itself at a dead end when it realizes that if it continues to orient life as before, it becomes impossible to live as before. So, the world really needs to be articulated or constellated or composed differently. As Jacques Derrida remarks, real invention is the invention of the other. It is the realization of something that until now appeared impossible, not the continuation of the past, a rupture with it. When thought sees the coming days only through the lens of impossibility, it sinks into indifference and despair. But when it sees the need of a future, despite the apparent impossibility, it arms itself with courage in order to demand the impossible. Although by definition one cannot know what the future will be, and that's really by definition, one can still imagine it. Indeed, imagination opens the only way there is to thinking about impossible futures. Of course, one cannot count on imaginary futures alone. And this is why one also needs to keep imagination in check by means of reason. So thinking towards future is thus an incessant exchange between reason and imagination. Reason is the technique of thinking, a thinking that already knows how to think. Imagination is what refuses these ready-made techniques and reaches towards unexpected things that thinking deems impossible. Thinking is needed to test imagination. But for thinking to meet the challenge of imagination, it must be able to let go of its routines and invent new techniques of operating. This is the moment of invention, the moment in which a former technique of thinking is overcome and simple possibility becomes reality. This is how invention occurs in the space between reason and imagination. It's their coincidence, the moment in which impossibility becomes reality. And that's, or something called rational imagination. So I don't have the time to give you any examples of that kind of rational imagination here. I have some in that leaflet, but well, that's just indications. But the point is mainly to say that the invention of an ethics and politics of a planetary world are one of these inventions that we really need today. And now, to close my talk, I would like to come back very briefly to the question that was my starting point, namely the question of nihilism. I have tried to push nihilism to an extremity, where it is no more a question of the erosion of the sense of human life, but of the erosion of non-human life itself, as exemplarity in the case of global warming. It feels a little bit awkward to describe this extremity in terms of nihilism, because I don't know whether I should say objective nihilism or natural nihilism or material nihilism, real nihilism. All of this sounds a bit weird. So this is why I chose to describe it in terms of disaster instead. Now the question is, and maybe you know it much better than I, is thinking of disaster nihilistic? Maybe it is simply realistic, insofar as thinking about the climate disaster consists in thinking about scientific facts as lucidly as possible. Unless, of course, nihilism is this realism. After all, Blanchot has also said that, I quote, science can only be nihilistic in the sense of world without sense, of knowledge based on ultimate ignorance, end of quote. The original formulation of nihilism concerns the sense of human life. And although nihilism rises from this feeling of the loss of such a sense, in the end, the crossing of nihilism amounts to an intensification of human life itself, as shown by Nancy and Vattimo. I have tried to show that instead of intensifying human existence, the realization of a disaster of global warming tends to weaken the sense of human life, because it enhances the sense of anonymity and impersonality. It's the discovery of this impersonality that shines through the effects of indifference and despair. But is this discovery of impersonality that shines through the effects of indifference and despair, is it nihilistic? This belief that anything I do is meaningless, or therefore I don't do anything, or perhaps anything we do is hopeless anyway. Is this the extreme of nihilism today? Or is it, on the contrary, the crossing of nihilism to the extremity in which confusion and disorientation turn into something like a courage facing the world, as it is, disastrous, but also wondrous, and certainly worthy of our efforts? Thank you for your attention.